Hello, and welcome back to my series on the Wars of the Roses. In the last episode we saw the continuing collapse of government authority in England, the houses of York and Neville forming an alliance, and the escalating feud between Richard of York and Somerset, culminating in the Battle of St Albans and the latter's death. In the aftermath of St Albans, the Yorkists were very much on top. York was once again effectively in charge of the country, the Nevilles had beaten the Percys, and the court faction was now leaderless and disorganised. York, the Nevilles, and the captive royal party arrived back in London the day after the battle. On the 9th of June, Parliament was called to discuss the events of the previous month, and decided that all the blame for it lay squarely on the shoulders of Somerset and his servants. After all, it's hard for a dead man to defend himself. After that, choice offices were handed out to the victors. York became Constable of England, and Warwick was made Captain of Calais. However, there was no great persecution of Somerset's surviving allies, and Parliament managed to remain somewhat independent of the feud. The reason for this was that at this stage the majority of nobility had remained neutral in the dispute between York and Somerset, and were desperately hoping that now one of the parties was dead, it would end. Unfortunately, St Albans only accelerated England's political division. Maybe if the political scene had stabilised, things could have got back to normal, but as usual, events intervened. Firstly, in July, King Henry once more slipped into madness. Although he had been well enough to open Parliament the previous month, the stress of the events of the past few months had caught up to him. With no one else really available, York was once more confirmed as Protector in November, thus beginning his second protectorship. Now unquestionably fully in charge of the country, he decided to do not very much. Just about the only thing York did to strengthen his hand was pay the Calais garrison the wages they were owed in arrears, which, while it did secure the loyalty of the kingdom's only professional army, was also not hugely impressive in the grander scheme of things. Part of the reason for this was that the security situation continued to deteriorate. In August, a dispute between two prominent Devon families, the Bonvilles and Courtenays, boiled over into murder and open warfare, which was awkward for York as the Bonvilles were allied to the Nevilles. Although he was able to resolve the conflict, it was on the terms of the Bonvilles, causing the Courtenays to throw their weight behind York's opponents. Meanwhile, in the north, King James II of Scotland saw the divisions within England as an opportunity, broke a truce, and attempted to seize the strategically important castle of Berwick on the border. Although he failed in that attempt, in May 1456 the King of Scots sent raiders south of the border in Northumberland, who engaged in looting and burning typical of their profession. By that point, York's protectorate was over, with him having surrendered the position in February. After this, the next few years of events become a little hazy. For one thing, Henry during this period is repeatedly slipping in and out of lucidity, although it does seem his wishes are respected. However, what is clear is that the government effectively moved to the Midlands. This was partly for economic reasons, with the Crown wishing to live off the estates of the Duchy of Lancaster, and partly for security reasons, as London continued to be unstable, and the Midlands effectively formed the government's power base. Likewise, Queen Margaret increasingly established herself as an independent faction opposed to York, with her power base concentrated on the Principality of Wales, which was owned by her son in his capacity as the Prince of Wales. She became a natural ally of York's enemies, of which there were now very, very many, largely drawn from the sons of the men he had killed at the Battle of St Albans. These angry young men had an unofficial leader in the form of Harry Beaufort, the late Duke of Somerset's son and the new owner of that title. These two important changes marked the growing polarisation in English politics, as the Queen sought to protect her son's interests, and York to protect his gains. In 1457 the government declined to pay the Calais garrison's wages, prompting Warwick to become a pirate to sustain himself, in what was a weirdly respectable career move for the time. In September the French got fed up with Warwick's shenanigans and sacked the port of Sandwich in Kent, which Warwick had been using as a supply base. This effectively signalled that the Channel was unsafe for shipping for the first time since the 100 Years' War. Slowly but surely the court was edging York and the Nevilles out of power. With disorder increasing at both sea and on land, in January 1458 Stafford managed to convince King Henry to call a great council at Westminster, in the hope of reconciling the court party and the Yorkists. Known to historians as the Love Day at St Paul's, the attempt did not get off to an entirely auspicious start, when both sides clattered into town with so many soldiers that the Mayor of London was forced to maintain 5,000 guards to police the event. The event was billed as a great reconciliation, with the special mass said by the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the great enemies of Beaufort, Exeter, and Warwick walking arm in a royal procession to St. Paul's, followed by York escorting Queen Margaret. The day concluded with a great pageant of jousting and feasting in the grounds of the cathedral. As you might suspect, the love day ultimately solved nothing. After all, this is a series on the Wars of the Roses, not the everyone gets along really well and has a good time of the Roses. The Nevilles and York playing along for a day didn't bring the men they'd killed at St. Albans back to life. It's for this reason you may begin to see St. Albans for the catastrophic political own goal it was. The carnage prevented York from ever reaching a settlement to cement his gains. Sure enough, plots and counterplots continued to circle after the Love Day, and by autumn it was as if it had never happened. Margaret now completely controlled the court and had managed to get her allies into all the major offices of state. With the Yorkists rapidly losing control of the situation, another great council was called in November 1458. By this point, Warwick had overshadowed his father, largely due to his wealth and more forceful personality. At the Great Council, a brawl broke out between his servants and those of the king. This led him to conclude that he was about to be assassinated, and thus he led a troop of his men to hack their way through Westminster to freedom. Queen Margaret promptly demanded that Warwick be arrested, while he hid in Calais and claimed that he had narrowly escaped assassination. From this point onwards, it was clear to everyone in the kingdom that civil war was just on the horizon. Throughout the winter of 1458-9, both sides began to actively prepare for war. The court withdrew to the Midlands once more, while Warwick continued to hide in Calais. Both sides called up as many men as possible. Come spring 1459, the court felt they were in a strong enough position to make their first move, calling yet another great council for June, which the Yorkists didn't even bother pretending that they were going to attend. At said council, the rebellious lords were convicted of various unspecified crimes. The die was cast, and the First War of the Roses was very definitely on. The initiative was seized by the Yorkists, who came up with a plan to have their three forces meet at Ludlow and advance as a single force to confront the king. Accordingly, Warwick set sail from Calais, and York and Salisbury set out from their bases of Sandal and Middleham respectively. Although York and Warwick successfully managed to evade the Lancastrian armies in the field and reached Ludlow, Salisbury was not so lucky. It was intercepted by a numerically superior army led by the Lords Audley and Dudley at Blore-Heath in Staffordshire on September 23rd. Left with no other choice, Salisbury realised he had to punch through the Lancastrians, thus starting the first battle of the Civil War. Audley and Dudley had formed up on the far bank of a small river called Wemberton Brook, and had tethered their line to a formidable hedgerow. Likewise, the smaller Yorkist force set up a small wagon fort, and took up defensive positions. For whatever reason, the Lancastrians advanced against Salisbury, despite the strength of their defensive positions. This first assault was beaten back by withering arrow fire, and a second resulted in the death of Lord Audley. Taking command, Lord Dudley launched a final assault with his knights dismounted, which succeeded in engaging the Yorkists in a melee. However, the Yorkist line held, and the Lancastrians collapsed and routed. Although Salisbury had won the day, the Battle of Blore-Heath was strategically insignificant. Though they had lost 2,000 men, the Lancastrians eventually regrouped, and Salisbury had to advance rapidly as other hostile armies in the area threatened his position. Nonetheless, he was able to proceed to Ludlow without further hindrance, and the three lords successfully linked up. Now believing themselves secure, the Yorkists sent a letter to the king justifying Salisbury's attack on the king's forces at Blore-Heath. However, Queen Margaret was not going to make the same mistake of waiting that had led to St. Albans. Instead, the Yorkists received a reply demanding the disbanding of their armies and the surrender of those responsible for Blore-Heath. When York stayed silent, the Lancastrian armies converged on Ludlow, finding the Yorkist positions entrenched in the town on October 12th. At this point, it was becoming clear to York's men that their leader might have miscalculated a bit, as despite combining their armies, York, Warwick and Salisbury found themselves outnumbered 3-1. Amazingly, the cream of the Yorkist army, the Calais garrison, suddenly grew a conscience, and decided that King Henry wasn't so bad after all. They defected to the royal army during the day, bringing with them knowledge of Ludlow's defences. At this point, York, Warwick and Salisbury all realised that their position was untenable. Bravely, they decided to run away during the night, abandoning their men and equipment. Upon realising what had happened, the Yorkist army disbanded the following morning, allowing the victorious Lancastrians to loot the town. Meanwhile, the fleeing commanders split into two groups. York and his second son Edmund, Earl of Rutland, fled to Ireland, while Warwick, Salisbury and York's eldest son, Edward, Earl of March, made their way to Calais. Their great rebellion had ended in utter humiliation and failure. The Queen wasted no time in pressing the advantage. Parliament was called in November and packed with royal supporters. Obviously had no problem passing writs of attainder on all three rebellious lords and their allies. FYI, this essentially declared that not only were the lords traitors, but so were the rest of their families, allowing the crown to take their land and use it as they pleased. Meanwhile, the exiled Yorkists continued to gather support in preparation for an invasion of the mainland. In June 1460 they made their move, with Warwick, Salisbury and Edward landing at Sandwich and capturing London without much difficulty at the beginning of July. However, they did not hang around and immediately set out for the court with an army of 10,000 men, leaving Salisbury behind with a smaller detachment to deal with Lord Scales, who was holding the Tower and its considerable arsenal. On 10th of July at Northampton they met the royal army encamped in a defensive position in the town, commanded by Stafford, Sir John Talbot and Sir Edmund, Lord Grey. King Henry himself was encamped in the town in a small tent positioned behind the front lines. Upon arrival, the Yorkists attempted to negotiate, but Stafford was having none of it and flat out told Warwick, "He shall not come to the king's presence, and if he comes he shall die." With the command, "I will speak with the king or I shall die," Warwick sent his army in at 2 p.m. At first it seemed as if the battle would favour the Lancastrians. However, Lord Grey ordered his men to lay down arms and let the Yorkists through their lines, having been promised lands in exchange. This crippled the Lancastrians and allowed the attackers to easily roll up their lines. Barely 30 minutes after the start of the battle, the Yorkists assaulted King Henry's tent, and Stafford, Talbot and the Lords Egremont and Beaumont were hacked down trying to defend him. With their commanders dead, the remainder of the Lancastrians dispersed and King Henry passed into Warwick's captivity. Their victory at the Battle of Northampton effectively left the Yorkists in the same position as they had been after St Albans. York returned from Ireland in September and was back in London in time for Parliament in October. Lord Scales, meanwhile, had been using the cannons in the tower to blow the merry hell out of the city. When he heard news of the defeat at Northampton, he surrendered and attempted to flee, but was lynched by a group of boatmen. While in London, York behaved as if he were king, most notoriously placing his hand upon the throne, which was greeted by a wall of stony faces from the watching nobility. However, Parliament stubbornly refused to make York king, royal blood and Henry's incompetence be damned. Instead, after a lot of deliberating, a compromise was reached. Henry would remain king, but York and his children would be declared Henry's heirs, and York would once again become protector. Like most compromises, this satisfied no one. York needed to be king to solidify his position, and everyone knew Queen Margaret would never accept any deal that would disinherit her son. Incidentally, the pair of them had managed to escape the disaster at Northampton, and were residing out of York's reach in Scotland. Likewise, Somerset had given up an attempt to seize Calais and was hiding in exile in France. Even within England itself, Yorkist control was limited. Lancastrian loyalists continued to hold out in Wales, led by Jasper Tudor, and in the north. With no evidence of either side backing down any time soon, the war would continue.